Hello again. Today we will start with morphology and some of the basics on this topic. Right. So, what is morphology? Morphology is the study of the internal structure of words, and in a way, it is both the oldest and the youngest subdiscipline in linguistics. It is the oldest because the earliest linguistic descriptions that we have are some very old Sumerian texts with lists of morphological words. And sorry, not morphological words, but with list of words, of inflected words in Sumerian at a time where Akkadian had replaced Sumerian as the spoken language. However, Sumerian was still spoken as a high prestige language and still learned. So these are probably the first morphological analysis that we know of. In a very different sense, morphology is probably the youngest subdiscipline in linguistics, or one of the youngest, because during most of the 19th and 20th century it received the least attention. It was until relatively recently that it was rediscovered as an interesting field to study, and it's still the ugly duckling in many linguistics departments, where they will often have a phonology chair and a syntax chair, but no morphology chair. And even in the introductory courses of linguistics, morphology tends to get the least attention in comparison to phonology or syntax. So there's that. And full disclaimer, I am a morphologist, so I might be a little bit biased in that sense. So here's an example of what I was talking about. These are ancient Sumerian tablets that were discovered in Mesopotamia, and we can see that they were building Sumerian paradigms. I'll talk about that in a bit, but basically how we organized inflected forms, and here you see the inflection of two verbs, to go away and to go in the past. You'll see here some clear evidence of inflection. So in the third singular, badu, and in the first singular, badun, so you see that there is a change in the form of the verb to go from the first singular present to the third singular present. You delete this u and bit, and there is a consonantal change. If you want to add an additional participant here, so bashidu, you can recognize that badu is still here, so he goes away, that part is still here, but now we have this shidu in the middle as an infix onto the word, which adds this participant to him, this kind of dative. And bashidun, again, same idea. The first singular form is still inside of this form with the dative, and the she adds the dative. Here we have a contrast between he went and I went, and you have this again and again, and again we're adding additional material, a vowel and an n, and to form the first singular form from the third singular, and we see the exact same. We're going to call these morphemes. I'll come back to it again in a second. This she morpheme that adds this dative participant. So clearly, many thousand years ago, people had already recognized that there are interesting patterns that happen in language, and that these are patterns of words, and that we can organize words in paradigms, and that for them this was about learning the language. For us, not necessarily, but we still do this when we need to learn a new language. We usually look at paradigms of verbs and try to memorize them or to learn them. This is not the only old text on morphology. I don't know if you've had some introduction to the history of linguistics. If you haven't, a very crash course on one person, Panini. He was an Indian grammarian, an Aryan grammarian. He wrote a grammar of Sanskrit with, I think, over 4,000 rules, all ordered. And there's been quite a lot of computational mathematical work on Panini and his grammar, basically showing that from hundreds of millions of possibilities to order his rules and his principles of the grammar, he basically chose one of the optimal ones. And he did this, I think, 4,000 years ago by hand. So it is a very impressive piece of linguistic work. And if you've ever worked with grammars, his grammar is still better than most, maybe not most, but that many grammars from the 20th century and most grammars from the 19th century. This is an impressive piece of work, and Panini heavily focused on morphology in Sanskrit, partly because Sanskrit has a lot of morphology, a lot of inflectional morphology. On the other end of the world, Greeks and Romans were also focusing on morphology of Greek and Latin, probably also because these languages feature morphology heavily, and they developed the first ideas of a theory of morphology that's called word and paradigm morphology. And this theory of morphology, I don't think that we'll have much time to go into it, but it's still used today. I subscribe to it, and some other professors at the institute actually also subscribe to this theory of morphology. It's not the most common one, and it's not the most popular one, but it's still around, and it was invented over 2,000 years ago. So that's pretty good. If you come up with a theory in linguistics and it holds its ground for 2,000 years, you did something very nice, because in linguistics, theories usually get replaced within 20 years or so. So that was pretty good from these people. So as I just mentioned, there are many schools in morphology. There are many types of morphological theories. Here are some examples of positions between lexical and word-based. We'll be focusing on lexical approaches and not word-based approaches. And lexical approaches basically means that we look at morphemes. Again, I'll come to morphemes in a second. Another position is inferential versus realizational, and we're here. So inferential is about relations between words, and realizational is about how you build words from smaller pieces, and that's what we're going to look at and what we will focus on. But I want to stress this. Most of the things I'm going to be talking about are not things in the real world. They are part of an analysis. And when I talk about morphemes, those are idealized structures. They don't exist outside. In reality, they are part of how we build our theories, and you should think of them as that. They are very, very useful, and they are widely used, but don't think that languages have these objects. These constructs, these theoretical constructs, are things we use to try to understand language, but it's not that languages have them. So that's an important point, and that's important because other theories do away without many of the things I'm going to teach you about. I'm going to teach you probably the most common theory, but there are alternatives. So let's start with two important ideas, or one idea with two concepts. The idea is that different languages vary in the amount of morphology that they exhibit. This is more or less unique to morphology. While languages do vary in the number of phonemes that they can use, they don't really vary in the amount of phonology that they have, or at least I've never seen that concept. And syntax also doesn't vary quantitatively like that. It's not like one language has more syntax than another one. However, morphology, yes. We can clearly see that there are some languages like Mandarin, Vietnamese, or Maori, where you have either no morphology or almost no morphology. I don't know if you've heard that Mandarin has no morphology. That's almost true. It has very little morphology. It has some cases, but not much. Vietnamese is even more extreme in this regard, and Maori maybe a bit less. Languages with low morphological content are usually called analytic or isolating, and on the other side of the spectrum, you have languages like Russian or Tundra Nenets or Swahili, which feature heavily on morphology, and this on different fronts. For example, Russian has a very extensive inflection class system for nouns and very complex aspect system for verbs. Tundra Nenets has both, has an incredibly complex system for nouns and verbs. While Swahili basically only has a very complex system for verbs, and nouns are relatively straightforward. So languages vary in the amount of morphology that they exhibit, but they also vary in where they exhibit their morphology. And importantly, this is a gradient. So it's not like we decide is a language analytic or synthetic, but rather you should think about this as does a language have very little morphology or does it have a lot of morphology? So, for example, English has much less morphology than Spanish, but it has a lot more morphology than Mandarin. So here are a couple of examples of very analytic languages with very little morphology. Here you have a sentence in Yoruba. Pause the video and take a look at it. I don't know if this is the first time you've seen glosses. This is a standard way of representing, or not representing, but presenting sentences in linguistics. We start with the sentence in the orthography, usually or phonetic transcription or phonemic transcription of the language. Here is orthography, and under it we give what are called glosses, and glosses are literal translations of the words plus grammatical annotation. So in this case, this non means they, o means future, ma is progressive, and I'm sorry I cannot do the tones well, kpa, or these co-articulations, they are very difficult. Esget, Ponun is pound, mewa is 10, and losose is weekly. So the line directly under it gives you an exact representation or an approximate representation of what each word is doing in the sentence, and the last line is a translation into English usually, or French or Spanish, whatever you're working with as the working language. And this sentence means they will be getting £10 a week, right? So they here is the subject. That could be annotated. It isn't, but it could. This tells you, well, it's a future and it's future progressive and it's get, so we'll be getting, and here's the construction for £10. You see the noun comes first, and then the numeral, and then at the end the adverb. Importantly here, there is basically no morphology in the sentence. If you look at Vietnamese, it is a very similar situation. You have, again, I won't try to read this with tones. Hai, dua, so two individuals leave each other, and this is a copula because of family koi husband. So they divorced of his family is the translation. Usually, or sometimes it can be very difficult just from the gloss to understand what's going on, but in this case doesn't matter much. There is very little morphology here, actually no morphology here. We can compare these examples with something like Swahili, which I already mentioned, or Lesbian, which I haven't mentioned. And in this case, in Swahili, you see several things. So we start with elephants, and then you see that we have wa, wili. And in this case, wili is two, but wa is plural inflection on the two. And that's morphology we put in there. And then we have a verb, which is jostle, and it has a lot of morphology, a lot of modifying morphemes. You have a third plural. In this case, I am going to guess it's the subject. Then you see a subordinator, which is key, and then you have additional markers here, which I don't remember exactly what it is. Here again is a third singular, the verb heard. This is a relative clause, and then the verb is and grass. So when two elephants and jostle, what is heard is the grass. You see that things like the number and person, and whether it's a relative or a subordinate clause, subordinator clause, are marked directly on the words themselves with what we would call morphemes. The same situation happens here in Lesbian. I won't go through this, but you see that there is all sorts of morphemic markers. And usually we separate morphemes in glosses and in text with a dash. So it's a single word, marfadi, but we're separating the part that indicates ergative from the rain part, from the noun. Alright, so what are morphemes? Well, morphemes are the smallest meaning carrying units in language. Here are two simple examples, coming from relatively complicated examples. If you compare words like cat to cats, or complex to complexity, well, you intuitively should be able to see that you can segment them into pieces. So here you have two pieces for cats, the part that means a cat and the part that says it's plural. For complexity, again, so one part is clearly complex or relates to the word complex, and et clearly doesn't, it's doing something else. In this case, cats is inflection, it's put in a plural from a singular, and et is derivation. It's building a noun from an adjective. So complex is an adjective, complexity is the property of being complex, and it's a noun. So this is what we are talking about when we say that we're doing morphological segmentation. You can give that a go. It's really easy. No, it's not really easy. It can be very hard, but in English it's very easy, because while English has some morphology, the morphology of English is very easy. the part of the form part, it's really simple. So there's not much going on here. You can see reads, washes, writes. You give this a go. Try to segment this and discuss them with the tutor, or if you have questions, you can also write to me. So the point is, we can distinguish between lexical and grammatical morphemes. The lexical morphemes have what we call lexical meaning. So in if you recall, in cats we have two morphemes: the cat morpheme, which has the lexical meaning of it being a cat, like in the real world, and the S has the meaning of plural. So plural is not a lexical object. Lexical morphemes are usually are the base or the root of the word. They can be either the stem or the root or the base, depending on exactly what we're talking about. We will distinguish between roots, stems, and bases at some later point. And an important point is that for most part, grammatical morphemes cannot occur on their own, and they can only occur if they are attached to roots and stems. If grammatical morphemes are segmental, like TS here, so it's composed out of individual segments, we call them affixes. If they are on the right, they are suffixes. If they are on the left, like here, like in Swahili, they are prefixes. And if they are in the middle, like in Akkadian, here the she, they are infixes. And affix, all those are types of affixes. There's also circumfixes. I'm sorry I didn't write an example. I can do it quickly. So in German, you have things like singen. No, that's a bad example. I shouldn't be trying to improvise here. Okay, rennen, right? This is to run. And the past is gerannt. So you see, there are several things going on here. Let me try to make this bigger. Ren is the stem or the base. We won't distinguish that today. And it carries the meaning of running. The en is an infinitive mark. We can see that because we see other forms like ich renne, or du rennst, or rennt. And here you see that we have some suffixes. And in the case of the past participle, we have a circumfix. A circumfix is a morpheme which we have reason to think is a single unit. In this case, we have reason to think that because it only appears together, and both parts are necessary for the meaning to appear. And it happens it comes from the left and from the right at the same time, and that's exactly what's going on here. So this is a circumfix in German, yeah. And they're relatively rare, so that's a relatively rare thing in German. Okay, back to the slides. This now if you recall from the phonology session, we had allophones, and if you remember, an allophone was a realization of a phoneme, and phonemes can have multiple realizations. Well, there's exactly the same concept in morphology from morphemes, which are allomorphs. So there are different realizations of a morpheme. If you look at that here, and if you try to segment Hungarian, let's look at it first. I mean, if you want to try, you can, but I'll go through it. And I'm sorry if I completely forgot Hungarian. I'll give this a go, but I might be my pronunciation might be completely wrong. So Utka is straight. If you know Slavic, this is pretty close to it. I think they are the same word. Not sure. In any case, so these are possessives. Sorry if I'm rambling a little bit. So these are possessive. We have Utkam and Utkam. So Utkam is my street. Utka is the street. If you compare it to Varos, which is city, Varosom, well, you see a similarity and a difference. Here, to build a possessive, we're just adding an M to the word. Here, we're adding an OM, and Barat. Again, we add an OM, Baratom, Baratom. There's something else. Yes, has, and Hazam. You're adding an AM, Kert, Kertem, AM, and here. And here, yes. So we won't talk about why this is and harmony and stuff. But the point is that position in Hungarian is can be expressed by multiple different morphemes, which are the same. So the different forms which are expressed in possession, and they are clearly related. They all have a vowel or possibly a vowel and an M marker there. So we call them allomorphs. They are variants of the same morpheme. There's a reason why they appear. I won't go into it, but there's a way of predicting which form it's going to appear in which case. Well, actually, give it a try. Try to figure out when each form appears. And if you feel daring, try to write a rule. That will be an exam question. To do this, I will give you words, you have to do the morphological segmentation, and there might be allomorphs, and you have to figure out what's what, and what the rules are. Okay, in German again. Allomorphy doesn't only occur in affixes, it also occurs in words. If you remember our example from 5 seconds ago, you see that the root which expresses, or the lexical morpheme here, the ren, can appear in a different fashion, so in a different form, from ren to ran. Here the same with plural in nouns, from tag to tage, from and I lost the vowels. I'm sorry for this. Here's Hund, Hunde, and I have no idea what's here. Let me pause this for a second and move it back. Okay, sorry for that. Here are the actual sounds. So here this is los, this is Hund, and this is Tag. Yes, so you see that for going from the singular to the plural, there is a change in the in the word, in the stem, right? Basically, this is what I had talked at some point of devoicing, and this sort of devoicing leads to allomorphy in this case, and then to the singular and the plural forms. Okay, so now to paradigm. I already mentioned that words are organized in paradigms. This is true for many types of words, mostly for verbs, nouns, and adjectives. Pronouns can also be in paradigms, demonstratives can also be in paradigms, but we mostly think of nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So, for example, if we are talking about reading, those are different words, but they also belong in a sense to the same core meaning, and we call that a lexeme. So these are word forms from a lexeme, and a lexeme is like an abstract word form which represents the core lexical meaning of many forms. Yes. So now if you compare with things, so read, speak, sing, dance, well, they have very similar paradigms. They are similarly organized. Here are the paradigms. This is the base. You could say the lexeme. And they have different forms in the third singular, in the past, and the gerund. And these paradigms are similar in both, so vertically. English is relatively boring in terms of its paradigms. Spanish is much more interesting. So here is the reduced paradigm of cantar, because it doesn't show many cells. But here are some of the cells in the paradigm. You see, so all these forms belong to the same lexeme. Cantar, which is that's the infinitive. The stem is cant, to the T, and different endings mark different cells in the paradigm. We usually organize paradigms this way, with columns representing one dimension, rows representing another dimension. This is fairly common, so columns in this case are representing tenses, and rows persons. This is probably the most common way in which we organize verbal paradigms, but you could also do it the other way around. It's also fine. Depends on what you want to show. And at least for cantar, it's relatively straightforward how you segment this into suffixes. Right. Because this is fairly straightforward, try and find the morpheme for the imperfect. And the morpheme for the past subjunctive. And again, that will be an exercise in the exam. You can discuss it with the tutors, or write me an email if you have any questions. And here's a different paradigm. This is a very famous language which is newer and spoken in Africa. I don't remember where it's gone. Sorry for that. You can check, I guess. But the point here is we have a lot of classes, right? So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 classes. And a class is a set of markers. So different nouns will take different markers and they belong to different classes. These are inflection classes. These are the possible morphemes for each inflection class. For example, cantar is in one inflection class. The combined set of forms, let's say morphemes in this case, for a lexeme makes the inflection class of that lexeme. In the case of nuer, there's inflection for case and number. So we have genitive, locative, and nominative, and singular and plural. So we have 6 cells in the paradigm, 16 classes, and very, very interestingly, we only have 2 markers. Yes, I don't want to say morphemes because the morpheme is the combination of the form in that position. Usually, let's call them markers. And according to how you organize them, which ones you pick for which case, you get a different inflection class. So this is a very extreme case. This is work by Matthew Berman. It's quite interesting, but it shows you in a way that the range variation in morphological paradigms that we find in inflection, and how things can change dramatically from many different affixes, like in Spanish, and I want to show you in the Netherlands, for example, to very few affixes, like in but many classes, because there's a lot of combinations. Morphology can also be suprasegmental. This is a Bantu language, Mokpe. Again, I can't do these co-articulations. This is not kupe, but pronounced at the same time. It's difficult. But in any case, so here you have nouns or types of classes of noun plus article, and different classes according to what the different nouns do. Now, what's interesting here is that if you compare, for example, class 1 with class 2, what you see that's going on is that in class 1 the article is a separate word. It's an E with falling tone, which is an independent word. In class 2, the article is a high tone that goes on the first vowel of the stem. Yes, so same idea for class 3 and class 4. So the point, class 10 has a different separate word for the article. The very important point here is morphology can alternate with independent words for certain things, and it doesn't have to be segmental. It doesn't have to be affixes. It can be suprasegmental. In this case, we would say that these are like floating tones or melodies. And this is fairly common. So Bantu languages do this a lot. Sort of marking morphology with tones. So I talked already a little bit about the distinction between derivation and inflection. Here you have some examples. Try to think about them. So what do you think is the difference between these relations between Bär, Bären and Bärs? And Natur, natürlich, Natürlichkeit, Kühlschrank, Essensbrücke und Fingerspitzengefühl. Well, the first one's inflection. You see that for Bär, Bären, and Bärs, all are intuitive. So they're all a noun, and they are in different, or they have different cases of the same noun. For B, we first have a noun, which is die Natur, and then we have natürlich, which is an adjective derived from the noun, and Natürlichkeit, which is again a noun derived from the adjective derived from the noun. And in C, here we have what are called compounds, which is when we take two different words and put them together to build a new word. German does this quite extensively. It's famous for that, for its infinitely long compounds. Here's just a couple of examples. Usually this is how we organize these types of morphological relations. Inflection changes or produces word forms from a lexeme, and operations that apply to lexemes are derivation and compound. And we usually call this here word formation and this inflection. So sometimes people talk about word formation and all of them, but the most common way of thinking about it is that word formation are these two processes, derivation and compounding. So some examples of inflection in English: we can inflect nouns like plural books or possessives, although this is debatable, but let's assume, like John's. Verbs like third person, she likes, or the progressive, she's working, past tense, she worked, and the past participle, she has studied, right? And adjectives with comparatives and superlatives, the smaller cat, the smallest cat. Here's a contrast. These are derivational affixes, and try to think about it. Try to tell me, or to figure out what sort of relation are these affixes building. And here it is. So the al affix is building nouns from verbs. So here we have refuse, and you build the noun from the verb refusal. You have dispose, you can build disposal. You have recite, you can build recital. Right. Here's the opposite. You have hospital, hospitalize. So from a noun goes a verb. Crystal, crystallize. From a noun comes a verb, etc. And I've tried to understand all of these examples. So, some constraints on derivation. So, is it the property of being unhappy, or is it happiness but the negation of it, right? So nes is builds properties from adjectives, and un builds negation from nouns. How could we test that? So if happy combines first with nest, then un would need to be able to combine with nouns, right? If un plus happy combines first, then nest needs to be able to combine with adjectives. Well, nest usually combines with adjectives, but un usually does not combine with nouns. So the more plausible structure is this one. And you can think about why that might be. So why doesn't the word famosity exist? Well, even though et usually derive nouns, there's already a noun which is fame, and this sort of situation it's relatively common in derivational morphology, where there's a derivation that you would expect, but that derivation doesn't actually happen, and that derivation doesn't happen because there's already a noun blocking the derivation. So in this case, it's fame. Okay. Now, some morphological rules. The first one, suppletion. It occurs mostly in inflection, and the idea is that it refers to allomorphs that are entirely different from the phonological shape of the other allomorphs. Here are some examples of suppletion. These are very common. So usually you have big, bigger, biggest, small, smaller, smallest, but then you have suppletion here from good to better and best. Right? Here usually is work, works, worked, sleep, sleep, slept, laugh, laughed, laughed. But be is was, and go goes went. So these are suppletive forms because they are quite phonologically different from the. But reduplication is another morphological process or rule. It's very complicated. There's all sorts of types of reduplication. Here is just an example. This is complete reduplication. In Turkish, you have adjectives, and to build the superlative, you reduplicate them, so you have them twice. And in Indonesian, you use reduplication to build a plural. So orang is man, orang is men. There are other types of reduplication where you only reduplicate part of the word, so a syllable or a segment. And conversion is very common in English. It's basically changing the syntactic category of a word to a different syntactic category of a word without any phonological process applying to it. So here are some examples. You can have the noun ink, and you can ink a contract, so that's conversion, or butter and butter the bread, or ship and ship the package, or nail and nail the short, and the other way around. You can run, but you can have a long run. And adjectives and nouns also. Dirty is an adjective, and you can dirty a shirt, or empty the box. And empty is an adjective. And I think that's quite a lot. We can leave it at that. And if you have